She didn't flinch when Warrant Officer Drennan read the order out loud. She didn't look at the other candidates. She didn't look at the ceiling, the way some people do when they're trying to hold something in. She just stood there, hands at her sides, eyes forward, and let the words land where they landed. Candidate Voss is hereby removed from the Advanced Marksmanship Program, effective 0600 tomorrow. Decision is final, no appeal window. The room was quiet for a second too long. That kind of quiet that happens when people know something is wrong, but have already calculated the cost of saying so. Mara Voss heard every word, and then she did something nobody in that room expected. She nodded once, not in defeat, not in agreement, just in the precise, controlled way of someone who has already decided that this moment is not the end of anything. It is data. It is a starting point. What Drennan did not know, what he could not have known from the personnel file sitting open on his desk, was that Voss had been doing trigonometry in her head since she was 9 years old. Not because she was taught to, because she found it calming, because numbers, unlike people, did not change their behavior based on who was watching. The Canadian Forces Northern Training Center sits about 40 kilometers outside of Cold Lake, Alberta, which is exactly the kind of place that feels abandoned until you understand what it's actually for. The base runs long-range marksmanship assessment cycles twice a year, winter and late summer, and the late summer cycle is the harder one, because the heat shimmer over the range distorts everything. Candidates who rely on instinct tend to drift. Candidates who rely on mathematics tend to hold. Mara Voss had arrived for the cycle 6 weeks earlier with a file that should have made the instructors curious and a face that gave them nothing to work with. She was 31. She had spent 4 years as a logistics coordinator in Petawawa, which was the kind of assignment that got you overlooked at exactly the moments that mattered. The file noted she had qualified expert on every range she had ever shot, but range qualifications at Petawawa meant nothing to the people who ran Cold Lake assessments. Different world, different standard, different tolerance for people who came from somewhere else. Chief Warrant Officer Glenn Harwick ran the assessment cycle. He had been running it for 9 years, and in 9 years he had developed a set of opinions that had gradually hardened into certainties. One of those certainties was that long-range marksmanship, the real kind, the 100-meter and beyond kind, was not a skill you could arrive with. It was a skill the program produced in the people who had the right base. Logistics coordinators from Petawawa were not the right base. He had said as much to his second, Sergeant Anita Price, during the first week of the cycle. "She's going to wash," he said. They were standing in the observation tower and Voss was on the range below, setting up for a 700-meter qualification shot. "I've seen that look before. She thinks being good at one thing means she'll be good at this." Price watched through binoculars and didn't answer immediately. She had learned that Harwick's predictions were correct often enough that arguing felt wasteful, and wrong often enough that she had stopped trusting them completely. Voss made the 700-meter shot. Then she made the next one. Then the wind shifted, a lateral gust that moved the flag at the berm from calm to 12 kilometers an hour, and she paused, made an adjustment that Price could not quite see from the tower, and made the third shot anyway. "She corrected for the wind," Price said. "Lucky," said Harwick. Below them, Voss was already resetting. What Harwick did not understand about Voss, and what would have changed everything if he had taken the time to read past the first page of her file, was that she had spent 2 of her 4 years in Petawawa running the unit's equipment loss analysis. An unglamorous job that required her to build a predictive model for when gear would fail, based on temperature, humidity, usage hours, and a set of variables that the previous coordinator had been tracking inconsistently for 6 years. She had cleaned that data herself. She had rebuilt the model from scratch, and in doing so, she had learned, without anyone teaching her, how to hold multiple moving variables in her head simultaneously and calculate a reliable output under time pressure. Long-range shooting is at its core the same problem: wind speed, wind direction, target distance, elevation change, atmospheric pressure, the temperature of the barrel, the specific ballistic coefficient of the round being used, the shooter's own heartbeat. It is not a physical skill first. It is a cognitive one. The physical part, the stillness, the trigger pull, comes after the mind has already done most of the work. Voss knew this. She had figured it out herself, alone, over 3 weeks of dry fire practice in her quarters at Petawawa, before the cycle began, cross-referencing ballistics tables with the same kind of variable mapping she had used to fix the logistics model. She had not told anyone this was how she was approaching it. It had not occurred to her that this was unusual. She thought she was just preparing. The other candidates noticed her groupings on the range and said nothing to her face. To each other, they said she was probably just having a good week. The range had that effect sometimes. You couldn't tell real ability from a temporary streak until the conditions changed. The conditions changed in week 4. The 100-meter range at Cold Lake runs north to south, which means late afternoon shooting has a sun angle that creates a specific kind of optical problem. A flare in the scope that forces the shooter to make adjustments to their natural cheek weld, which shifts their point of aim, which requires a compensating correction that most people don't catch until their shot group has already drifted. Harwick knew about this. He scheduled the week 4 assessment for late afternoon on a Tuesday deliberately, not to eliminate anyone specifically, just to see who had been paying attention. Voss had been paying attention. She had clocked the sun angle on day 1 and spent a week recording the exact time the flare appeared and how long it lasted. She had adjusted her scope position during dry fire practice until the flare no longer affected her weld. It had taken her 4 days of patient, boring, unobserved work. She shot a 1.2 MOA group at 1,000 meters in the late afternoon sun on Tuesday. Harwick reviewed the results in the scoring tent, and the expression on his face was not admiration. It was closer to suspicion. People who shot 1.2 MOA groups at 1,100 meters in difficult conditions had stories behind them. Training histories, lineages, mentors who had passed on specific techniques. Voss did not have those stories. She had come from logistics. The number in front of him did not match the biography in the file. He called her in the next morning. "Walk me through your process," he said. He had the target print in front of him, and he was not looking at it. Voss walked him through it. She described the sun angle calculation. She described the scope adjustment. She described how she had arrived at her wind correction using the flag movement at the 800-meter berm as a proxy for the terminal wind at the target. She used numbers throughout. She was precise. Harwick listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Where did you learn that flag method?" he asked. "I worked it out from the ballistics manual," she said. The flag as proxy technique is described in Annex C. I cross-referenced it with the weather data I'd been logging since week 1. "You were logging weather data since week 1. "Yes, on your own time, yes." Harwick looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes and waited. "Dismissed," he said. It would be easy to read that exchange as the moment Harwick started to feel threatened, and that reading would not be entirely wrong. But the fuller picture is more complicated, because Harwick was not a simple man. He was a man who had spent 9 years building a system he believed in, and Voss was not fitting inside that system in any way he had anticipated. That was genuinely disorienting. Systems that have worked for 9 years are not easy to update. The mind resists it, not out of malice necessarily, but out of the deep structural discomfort of having a foundational belief contradicted by evidence you cannot dismiss. The problem for Harwick was that he had already started dismissing it anyway. He began scheduling Voss for the high difficulty range slots. Wind from the northwest days, full overcast days when the light flattened everything. Dawn shoots when the temperature differential between the barrel and the air was most extreme. He rotated the other top candidates into the controlled condition slots. He didn't announce this. He just did it. Price noticed by the end of the second week of it. She tracked the scheduling in the range log because tracking the range log was her job, and the pattern was clear enough once you were looking for it. She mentioned it to Corporal Taylin Breslow, who ran the range equipment and had been quietly rooting for Voss since week 2, and Breslow mentioned it to nobody, but she started keeping her own notes. Voss, for her part, did not notice the scheduling pattern as a pattern. She noticed that her conditions were consistently harder than what she observed on the range from the observation platform on her off hours. She assumed it was coincidence. She kept shooting. Her scores kept climbing. The order to remove her from the program came at the end of week 6. and it came fast enough that it felt like a door closing before anyone had a chance to reach for the handle. The stated reason was failure to demonstrate consistent performance under assessment conditions, which was a phrase that could mean almost anything and which meant almost nothing when measured against the range logs. The range logs showed 11 sessions. In 11 sessions, Voss had recorded the 4 highest individual scores in the current cycle. She had shot in conditions that no other candidate had been assigned to. Her worst score was still in the top quartile of the group. Price read the dismissal order in the administration building and read it twice. She went back to her office and pulled the range log and sat with it for approximately 20 minutes. Then she went to find Breslow. "She's got the logs?" Price asked. "I don't know what she has," Breslow said. "If she has them, they tell the whole story." Breslow was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about what it cost to confirm that. "She's been keeping notes," Breslow said finally. "I know that much." Mara Voss had been keeping notes since week 1. This was not a strategic decision. This was who she was. She kept notes the way other people kept receipts, not because she anticipated needing them, but because the act of recording created clarity. Her notebook contained weather observations, shot data, scope settings, wind readings, and, beginning in week 3, a running log of her range assignments alongside the assignments of the other top candidates. She had started logging the discrepancy not because she suspected anything deliberate, but because the discrepancy was anomalous, and anomalies were interesting. By week 5, she had 17 data points. By week 6, she had 23. The statistical probability that the scheduling differential had occurred by chance was approximately 3%. She had written that calculation in the margin of her notebook in pencil, and then she had closed the notebook and gone back to preparing for the next morning's shoot. When Drennan read her the dismissal order, Voss nodded once and walked back to her quarters and sat down on the edge of her cot. The notebook was on the table beside her. She looked at it. She was not thinking about what to do next. She already knew what to do next. She was thinking about the specific silence in the room when the order had been read, the way the other candidates had not looked at each other, which was different from looking away. Looking away was avoidance. Not looking at each other was the particular stillness of people who are registering something that they do not yet have permission to respond to. Courage, she had come to believe, was less about the absence of fear than about the absence of waiting. Fear was present in almost every meaningful situation. Waiting was the variable you could control. She picked up the notebook. She opened it to the scheduling log, and then she wrote, at the bottom of the last data page, in the same precise hand she used for everything else. The record is the argument. The numbers don't require interpretation. What happened next did not happen quickly. Real accountability rarely does, which is the part that the story tends to leave out. There is a version of this where Voss walks into a room with her notebook, and someone immediately sees the truth, and the truth immediately produces justice. That version is satisfying, and it is also not accurate. What actually happened was this. Voss submitted a formal request for administrative review of her dismissal to the unit standards officer, which was her right under Queen's regulations and orders, and which required the standards officer to acknowledge the request within 48 hours. The standards officer was a major named Ren Calloway, who had been in the Canadian Forces for 19 years and had reviewed approximately 60 administrative disputes in that time, and had the particular exhausted precision of someone who had learned that most disputes were complicated, and most of the complication was created by people who should have known better. Calloway read Voss's submission, which included the scheduling log, the shot-by-shot score comparison, the weather observations, and the margin calculation. She read it twice. Then she pulled the official range logs from the administration system and checked them against Voss's data point by point. They matched. Everyone. Calloway called Price that afternoon. She did not call Harwick. The range logs, Calloway said. How long has this scheduling pattern been in place? Price paused for exactly 2 seconds. Later, she would think about those 2 seconds often, about the weight of what was on either side of them. Since week 3, she said, and you have documentation. I have the official log. That's documentation, Calloway said. Harwick was informed of the review 4 days later. He was given the opportunity to provide a written response, which he did. The response was 3 pages long, and it argued, in careful but increasingly strained language, that the scheduling differential reflected legitimate training design decisions and that Voss's dismissal was based on holistic assessment criteria that went beyond individual range scores. Calloway read the response. She found it unpersuasive. Not because it was dishonest, she was not certain it was entirely dishonest, but because the phrase holistic assessment criteria had no corresponding documentation in the official record, and things that were not documented did not exist in administrative reviews. This was the foundational logic of the process, and it was not negotiable. The review took 11 days. At the end of it, Calloway issued a finding that the dismissal of candidate Voss was not supported by the documented record, that the scheduling differential constituted an irregularity requiring remediation, and that Voss was to be reinstated to the program with her scores preserved and her standing recalculated on the basis of her full performance record. Harwick was reassigned from the assessment cycle with immediate effect. The language of his reassignment was administrative, not disciplinary, which was the kind of distinction that mattered enormously to the people inside the system and considerably less to everyone else. Price told Breslow what had happened on a Thursday afternoon, standing outside the equipment shed in the early autumn cold that comes to Cold Lake in September, like it means business. She kept the data, Breslow said. She kept everything, Price said, every number, since day one. Breslow thought about that. Because that's just how she is, she said. Not because she knew she'd need it. That's exactly it, Price said. That's what made it real. Voss returned to the range on a Monday morning. The light was flat and the wind was coming from the northwest at 11 kilometers an hour, gusting to 16. She set up in the third lane, checked her data book, made her calculations, and settled into position. The shot at 100 meters landed where she had calculated it would land. She recorded the data. She reset. She prepared for the next shot. Around her, the other candidates were doing the same things they had been doing for 7 weeks. The range looked exactly as it had always looked. The berms, the flags, the gray Alberta sky. Nothing about it announced that anything had changed. But Breslow, watching from the equipment shed, wrote one line in the margin of her own notebook that day. She kept it for years afterward. One person decided to count. That was enough.